Hi, welcome. My name is Mark Florance. I'm the co-chairman of the Energy and Utilities Committee at BritCham here in Singapore. We are running a series, we're summarising effectively the key takeaways of the event we just did with SUE, the Singapore International Energy Week. We were invited as BritCham to do a session, which I think was a very content-rich and useful discussion. The first topic we talked about was really the overriding policy issues around how we are going to, I guess, make this transition in the energy sector. And we had Tim Rockell, our chair, speaking, as well as Tom Moody from the UK government. And that was a very interesting session. Now we're moving on to the second session, which covered, I should say, the energy transition and scaling up of investments in Southeast Asia. And Allard Nooy, who is the MD for APAC for InfraCo, led that session as a moderator. So Allard, what do you think were the key takeaways from the session? And who are the panelists? We should possibly mention panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Mark. And Mark and I are both co-chairs, actually, of BritCham Singapore Energy and Utilities Committee, a very active committee at BritCham. I moderated the session on energy transition in ASEAN, and my panelists included Nikki Kemp from the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and she runs basically the Sustainable Development Infrastructure Finance Initiative here in ASEAN. And I had, in addition to that, Paul Jordan of the UK Catapult, as well as Pranoy Chowdhury. A very interactive session where we covered energy transition. We did touch on that energy transition is not just about adding more renewables to the grid. It's much more than that. We spoke in detail what is needed to develop plans to retire and replace coal-fired power capacity in the region, and planning for that transition, which will ultimately require new baseload and cross-border low-emission power generation. We also talked about the challenges about the intermittency of renewable energy and the requirement for technology development for battery storage facility. And a great discussion around the development of carbon capture storage, as well as green hydrogen, and whether this is fantasy or fuel of the future. But the general consensus is that low carbon hydrogen has currently a tiny share of the global energy market, but the potential is absolutely great for particularly green energy, and in particularly zero carbon hydrogen. The risks around carbon pricing were in detail discussed, and the requirement of the public and the private sector cooperating on this to make that system work, but also to get the financing in place between the public and the private sector, so both domestically and internationally, to get to a lower carbon generation capacity, retire coal-fired power stations, and putting new cross-border renewables on the grid. A very interesting session, I must say.
No, I agree. It was very interesting. And I think the topic obviously was scaling up investments in Southeast Asia, and both you and I work for organizations which are just doing that. And so you work for InfraCo, I work for a company called Climate Investor One. And in both cases, what the main objective of those is to kickstart the investment and the development of renewable energy and other sustainable infrastructure in this part of the world. And I think the story is quite encouraging. I think in both the organizations we work for, we've seeded quite a lot of investments in a lot of countries, which have then led to further development of those particular sustainable assets, particularly renewable energy. So I think it's a long way to go, but certainly it's been encouraging to see the start.
That's correct.
Is there anything
Mark.
else you want to mention, Allard?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned InfraCo Asia. So the company which I've been CEO of since 2013, we are designed to take very early stage development risk. And more than 50% of our current investment portfolio in 35 project joint ventures across 10 different low and lower middle income countries in South and Southeast Asia are in the renewable energy space. And we're very complementary and sometimes work together with Climate Investor One and climate fund managers on projects to basically be the catalyst to de-risk projects. And once they are sufficiently de-risked or have come into operation, then attract further private sector capital to these markets where institutional investors in particular, but also other private equity funds are not willing to take that very early stage development risk. And once you have a financial close and or are post commercial operation, they are willing then to come in. So that catalytic role is going to be key to further develop renewable energy generating assets in this part of the world. The other requirement which we're trying to push with the various different governments around the region is enabling legislation and preventing sort of regulation which prevents FDI to come in. Once you see countries opening up, particularly the renewable energy sector for foreign direct investment, there is sufficient capital around in the various stages of project development and in the various capital structures to then attract these investments required. And in particular, there is one country where we're both active, Mark, which comes to my mind, and that's Vietnam. Vietnam, there are no restrictions on FDI in the renewable energy sector. So unfortunately, there are a few other countries in the region which still have limitations or ceilings in terms of FDI percentages coming into the renewable energy space.
I see the point you make is very interesting. Vietnam's a good example. Is what the fund Climate Investor One does is invest equity because the banks aren't comfortable yet in a lot of these geographies, and they're not really comfortable that the government is going to follow through on their promises around PPAs and so on. So I think that's all part of the big picture on how we scale up investments in Southeast Asia. Financing is a big element of it, and obviously we're both involved in that. So I think the session covered all these topics and it was very interesting. Is there anything else you want to add before we finish off?
No, financing, I mean, you can set whatever targets you want to set in terms of the route to net zero and the further CO2 footprint reduction methodologies. But if you're not having enabling legislation around that and the financing structures being designed, very often being led by the private sector, then you wouldn't be able to get to the implementation in that area.
Absolutely. And Vietnam's a good example where it's actually working. So it's encouraging. Okay, well, thank you very much, Allard. Thanks for your time. The next in our series, we're going to be talking, thank you. We're going to be talking about developing a hydrogen economy and CCUS, which I think is a very big part of the picture. Well, thanks again.